Alright, this is a video demo of Project 4 found in Learning Module 5. We're going to be doing basically what we did in Project 3, making a good music edit, but in this case we're going to try to edit one of these pieces to a specific length, that being 1 minute or 60 seconds. We're going to be using the same music files that we used in Project 3, with one exception. If you do want to use FCS32 number 10, that's already a 60. So you can use that, but in this case, make it a 30-second as opposed to a 60. But all the other pieces, if you pick one of those, you should edit those to 60 seconds. Now, if there's another piece that you'd prefer to use, that's fine, as long as the piece has a hard ending. If the piece has a fade-out ending, don't use it, because I can't really tell whether you just faded it out or that's the way the piece ended. So either download the Project 3 and 4 elements again, or if you already have them downloaded from last week, just use those. Launch Audition, and when it launches, go to File, New, Multitrack Session, Command-N, or click on the multitrack button there. When the Session Parameters page opens up, in the session name, put your first name, last name, and Project 4 or P4. Put it on the desktop or wherever you normally would put a project. Don't use a template. We're going to do this again at 44.1 because all the music came from CDs and it's all at 44.1. And like all the projects we're going to do this semester, we're going to do them at 32-bit and stereo output. And then click OK. So Audition will open in the edit window. And let me point out here that sometimes the windows get moved around a lot and you may be missing windows or whatever. And sometimes students get really upset because the edit window page doesn't look correct. You can go to Window, Workspace, and then click on Default. And that'll put everything back to the way maybe you're used to seeing it. Just like the templates, there are some presets for other types of projects, but default is the one that you're probably used to seeing. So you might want to make sure that's checked. So we're going to import the audio files now. So either do Command-I or go File, Import Files. Browse over to the Downloads folder where the project files are. Select the 8 files and then click Open. And then they should appear in the Files panel in Audition. As I mentioned last week, if the blue speaker icon is highlighted at the bottom of the Files panel, you can actually audition these files without having to drag them onto the timeline. So you can just click on a file, it'll start to play. If you want to stop it, the play button there, which looks normally like a right arrow button, turns into a square button, which is a stop button as soon as you start to play. So you click on that and it'll stop. Or you can click on the next file and it'll start to play and the previous one will stop. Here's a video from my ebook about editing music, which I think will be appropriate to play right now. Often music will need to be edited to fit radio and television commercials, presentations, films, web, and theatrical productions. Music is written to flow naturally from one section to another, for example, from a verse to a chorus and back to a verse. When the editor can identify the musical structure, the location of exactly where to edit will be more obvious. Generally, cutting from the beginning of one section to the beginning of a similar musical section, for example, from one chorus to another chorus, will almost always sound natural and undetectable. When shortening a piece of music to a specific length, the editor will often identify a section of music close to the end of the piece that also includes the ending. This section can be a long or short phrase, or possibly only the last chord. As an example, if a piece of music were to be shortened to 60 seconds, the editor would first locate a phrase near the end. If that phrase were 12 seconds long, then the editor would look for a spot around 48 seconds from the start of the piece to make the splice. What usually makes this work is that there's often a long decay on the final musical note, which can be as much as 10 seconds. This gives the editor a range of several seconds to make the splice. In some cases, other musical phrases may have to be deleted or added to make the timing work, and in all cases the edit must be on the proper beat and at a spot that works musically. In other words, if it sounds like someone wrote the music that way, it's probably a good edit. From these 8 files, I'm going to select DWCD0484 number 2, which is probably the easiest one in here to edit the time. The reason is that there are so many places in this song to edit. I'm going to drag that onto the timeline on track 1. And as typical with all CDs, we usually check the front to make sure there's no silence. I mentioned that whenever you're dealing with a CD, there's going to be anywhere from a half a second to over a second of silence at the front. And that's done on purpose by the CD mastering person because they want to make sure that the CD isn't queued up too tightly so that the front gets upcut. So we want to trim it off. On this particular piece, there's not very much to trim off, but we're going to trim it off anyway, because when we're delivering a file for somebody, we want to make sure it actually starts with sound. There's no silence on the front. I also mentioned last week that sometimes it's a time saver to use the time selection tool, which is the one that looks like an I-beam or a vertical line. It's the one that's highlighted blue there. That allows you to click and drag around a selection, and then when you do Command K, it actually puts a split on both sides. It's kind of like doing two things at once. Again, there's not much silence on the front of this, but I'm going to use the time selection tool. I could have just used the trimmer tool or just the regular move tool and marked it, but we did it with that. And then I'm going to hit Shift Delete. It's going to pull that up snug against the beginning of the timeline. I'm going to make sure that only the silence at the front is highlighted. I'm going to hit Shift Delete, which is going to pull everything up snug against the front of the timeline. In Premiere, they call that a ripple delete because it ripples the EDL. So I'm going to highlight where it says track 1. You see it turns white. Then I'm going to go into multi-track tracks, duplicate selected tracks, and that's going to create a copy just below track 1. I'm probably never going to want to hear this track. I just want to be able to see it to compare the beats when we make an edit. And that way I can adjust the timing of the edit once we make it. So I'm going to right-click on the file or control-click if you don't have a right-click and do mute. So you can see the file now is grayed out. I'm going to hit the backslash key, and that's going to show me the entire session. We can see from the timing, it looks like this piece is about 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I'm not going to spend the time like I did in the Project 3 demo to go through and put markers on all the verses and choruses and like parts. I did that mainly to show you how that was done in Project 3. But I'm going to try to find a section near the end that I can actually perhaps join to the beginning. So I found a piece, it's around 3:23, give or take a second or two. So I can fine-tune this if I zoom in. I want to put the marker right at the beginning of the attack. By the way, in this particular kind of a project, I want the mode to be that the playhead will return to the original start position when you hit stop. You do Shift X to toggle between those two. But I'd like to be able to audition the edit first, so I'll play the edit. If it sounds good, I'll hit the space bar. It jumps back to where I started, and I know I don't have to find that spot again. So once I've auditioned that spot and I know I've got just the part I want right on the attack of that note, I'm going to hit Command K to split the file at that point. I'll highlight the end portion of the file, and then I'll look in the Properties panel under Info to see how long it is. And it says it's about 17.5 seconds, 17.447. So I know then that if I'm going for a 60, I want to find a spot somewhere around 43 seconds. 43 plus 17 makes 60, so that I can make the edit. And if I'm close, this has a really long fade out on the very end. I can actually be a little later than 43 seconds, and it will still work. I'll just fade it faster. So I'm going to jump back to around 43 seconds and hit play and see where I might be able to find a spot where I can cut. I found a spot close to 43 that I think will work. It's at 46. It's not exactly the same musical phrase that I'm cutting on, but it's the beginning of a musical phrase. We call that a cadence point, and that would be a good place to make this edit. So I'll zoom in so that I can see and hear the edit more accurately. I'll put the playhead right at the beginning of the attack like I did in the previous edit. I'll audition the edit by hitting the space bar. If I like it, I'll hit the space bar again. It'll jump back to that spot, and then I'll hit Command K to split the file. Then I'll highlight the piece between the two edits. I'll either zoom out or hit the backslash key to see the entire session there with that piece highlighted. And then I'm going to hit Shift Delete, which is going to do a ripple delete, or it's going to pull those two pieces together. So when I zoom in on the edit, it looks like I may have done a pretty good job. It looks like the green and the white are pretty much in sync, which is great. I'll play the edit. The edit sounds good. So I think I made a perfect edit. I don't need to really do any adjusting. All I need to do now is look at the end and see how long I am, because I know I'm going to be a little bit long. I was shooting for 43, and I ended up making the edit at 46. When I look at the end of my file, I think I'm okay, though, because it looks like the final chord hit before 60 seconds. It goes on to about 1.3.5 or so. I'm going to put the playhead right at 1 minute and hit Command K to split that. I'm going to highlight and then delete by hitting the delete key, the portion from 1 minute to 1.3.5. Then I'm going to click and highlight the end piece of my edit. And when I do, in the upper right-hand side of the file, near the end there, I'll see the fade handle. I can grab that with a mouse and drag that to the left, which will produce a fade. You always want to do that so the piece doesn't start fade, 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 and then just chop off right at 60. You want it to go smoothly to silence, if possible. Depending on where my mouse is relative to the file as I'm dragging the fade back, I can get a different shape on that yellow fade line. And you may not even notice much difference, but that's probably a good fade there. So I don't really need the reference track, the one that's on track 1.1 anymore. So I'm going to highlight that and then hit delete just to blow that one off. So I'm going to hit the backslash key. That's going to show me everything on the timeline. It's going to look pretty much like you're seeing there with a little bit of silence on the right side. But it's a good check. That way I know I don't have any garbage way out on the timeline that's going to end up in the export. So just like with all projects, this file that I've edited doesn't actually exist except as pieces of that original parent file. So I have to actually export this so it actually becomes a file. So I'm going to go File, Export, Multitrack Mixdown, Entire Session. When this window opens, you'll notice I don't have to actually enter the name of the file since it names it after the session I created. I'll put the file on the desktop since it's easy to find there. I'm going to export it as an MP3. By the way, for this project, Canvas will only accept an MP3. It won't accept any other file format. I'm going to change the sample rate and bit depth if it's not already changed to 44.1 and 16-bit because that's perfect for an MP3. I want to make sure the format setting is 192 kilobit per second constant bit rate. That's perfect. And then I'm just going to click OK. So then you can locate your file on the desktop. You can play it. It's always a good idea to do that to make sure that the file is what you think it is, that it in fact has sound and it's not like 20 minutes long or 2 seconds long. Then go to Canvas, go to the project page, click Submit Assignment, scroll down to the bottom of that page, click Choose File, find it on the desktop, choose it. When you see it there on the page, you know you've got it, then click Submit Assignment and you're done.